welcome back to the fourth Revelations episode. I guess it's weird when I say welcome back to something that I'm starting over. Welcome to Revelations 4. Topic today is modules versus homebrew, which...
Or for those who are unfamiliar with what modules are, we mean running an adventure that is prepared that you can buy off the shelf or coming up with your own.
Right. And the title kind of presents it as it's just like this dichotomy. You either are running something that someone else has done or you are, wholesale inventing something. And that is, rarely the case that it's all one or all the other. But I just wanted to have us kind of talk about what are some of the good things and the upsides and downsides to either approach and ways that you can potentially modify either one or kind of find the best of both worlds. What are your initial thoughts when I kind of present the topic?
Well, it's a deep and interesting topic. I think before we get into what we think about it all, and excuse me, I'm like coughing a lot today. I think you and I should both give a brief overview of our history with respect to running and playing in games.
Sure.
Because I know that we've both run and played in modules and homebrew scenarios quite a bit.
Yeah.
I like skipping to the end. They're both extremely important. Most of what I do is a fusion of both. And I think they definitely have their place. But leverage them differently in different scenarios, and I'm sure we'll fare through that.
Yeah, I think all of that is great, true, and yeah, we will hit all of those things. But yeah, I'll start with my kind of history with running things, because obviously this is more a question for the GM side than the player side. So the first couple things I did with D&D were all homebrew, in the sense that a lot of it was sort of introductory, like session 0 kind of things. This is when I introduced both you and Jack to Dungeons and Dragons, playing it. The longer version of all this is Jack had bought the player's handbook a long time ago, and then I read it, and I got really interested in it, and then I'm the one who actually started running games. But
this is as an adult, right?
Yes,
you're not a
correct.
kid.
Yeah. It was relatively recently. Yeah, we were all adults, but so I used a lot of just very basic premises that I just came up with as little one shots to introduce concepts and to practice running the game. But when it comes to actual long content, the first time I really played any TTRPG, I was DMing, and I was running Curse of Strahd, 5th edition. Then when we were done with that was with a group of my friends from work. Then I ran a homebrew campaign, just one that I had made up entirely by myself for you and some of your friends. And then since then, everything that I have run has been stuff that I have made up. It's all been homebrew. So really, running Curse of Strahd is was the only module that I've ever done as a game runner, and then everything else is homebrew because I enjoy that more. We'll kind of get into it a little bit, but that's not to say that everything that I did was superior to modules, because that's not true. But that's just my preference, is to build that stuff myself. But that's my history. What's yours?
So the first thing I ran at scale, I guess, was a Tomb of Annihilation campaign. So that's a well-known module that was in D&D 5th edition. Mm-hmm. But the session 0 I ran, which I think was actually the first session of any kind that I did, was a session 0 leading into a big campaign, which is aggressive.
Yeah.
And that was a homebrew scenario. And
which one was that? Was that the one where we were sailing into that port and fighting the ghost ship, or are you talking about the one where we were
that one
going into the island temple and fighting the spice dragon or whatever it was.
That was now we would call it a downtime. The second one you described was a Monster of the Week thing.
Yeah. Okay.
But what I did, I was running a module as a campaign, but mixed in, there were homebrew locations and scenarios, and there were also a lot of like third-party content scenarios. So looking around on DM's Guild, there was a lot of stuff that was already ready to slot into Tomb of Annihilation, like it was in the same setting. Or it was stuff that was in a similar jungle or island setting that was close enough, and I put that in as well. So it wound up being kind of a mishmash. So anyway, I ran that campaign, and for a sense of scale, I think it took us 45 sessions, something like that.
I believe, it's something like that.
And they were, a lot of these were long. I mean, the longest session was like 8 hours.
At least, yeah.
And the shorter ones were, a more normal, like 2.5, 3 hours.
Yeah, no, it was way different than what we've been doing since then.
Yes. So these were like your classic full day, almost, kind of old school D&D sessions. But so I ran that campaign. I took a little bit of time off and started experimenting with other systems, and was mostly running, not modules, because it wasn't like campaign length stuff, but a lot of one-shots that were published scenarios.
I think in this context, I consider those modules. It's basically whether it's something, if it's homebrew, it's something you made. If it's, if it's not that, then it's a module.
I would say, and I'm quibbling here, but that's homebrew versus published, and a module is a campaign.
Okay.
But whatever. Point being, I was working with published scenarios, but it was a lot of Delta Green and Mothership stuff that was meant to take 1 to 4 sessions. And then at some point we switched from that and did Curse of Strahd, which is another, probably the most well-known module. Also D&D 5th edition. And then we went to the Delta Green campaign, and that was a homebrew frame story that contained a couple of published adventures that I modified. And this is what I meant before when I said a lot of what I do is effectively a fusion of these two things, because I don't think, well, and I'm going to steal a lot in this episode from Matt Colville. I don't know if you saw his recent video on, I don't even remember what the original topic was, but he was basically saying that he didn't think campaign level modules should be the default.
I haven't watched any of his stuff in a while, but
okay. Well, I'll get into that in a minute, yeah. But
I do share that initial instinct.
And at present, I am not running anything for the podcast, although we've talked about spinning up some one-shot stuff. I am running a campaign at where I work for some of my coworkers, and that is similarly Tomb of Annihilation with significant homebrew and third-party inserts. So that's my background. I'm like you, all over the place.
Yeah. So, and I think so. I made this list that I know you just said that you hadn't really looked at, but I have a list of kind of pros and cons for modules and homebrew stuff, and then some further discussion points. But I want to kind of hit some of those pros and cons just as jumping off points that we can discuss. For modules, you already hit a couple of some of the pros that are really, really kind of powerful. One of them is right, and so when I was talking about modules, I was mostly talking about generally pre-published content of you're running something someone else has published, but most of those do tend to be that campaign length thing as well. But one of the things you already hit is that there is a lot of other content for that online a lot of times if it's a popular adventure. So if you're a DM running Curse of Strahd or Tomb of Annihilation or one of these kind of really popular modules, there's a ton of extra stuff online, like other tools, resources, maps, character ideas, like all sorts of stuff that if you want to run that, there's all this additional stuff out there, most of which is free, that you can tack on or not as you see fit, which I think can be really, really useful when you're trying to run one of these sessions. And I know you've used quite a bit of that stuff.
Yeah, and that gets to one of the things that you have in your pros column, which is, I think, what probably draws most people to modules in the first place, which is the idea that running a module is going to be less work. You're not going to have to prepare as much because there's a book with all this content in it, and then there's all this additional stuff you can get for free or relatively cheaply on sites like DM's Guild or DriveThruRPG, or just subreddits that are dedicated to the module.
Yeah, and
I think that's
still
true.
Work.
Well, there's a ton, and I'd like to talk about that, which is I think it's easy to forget, especially if you're new, that it's great that there's a book there, but you have to know what's in it.
Mm-hmm.
And so these modules, they're big books. If it's a campaign level one, if we're talking about Curse of Strahd, it's a few hundred pages.
Yeah,
and it's not like reading a novel or something. There are all kinds of connections that you need to probably read through it a couple of times to make sure you understand how the pieces fit together. Because ultimately, the players are going to be talking to NPCs or exploring a location, and you need to remember, oh, right, this ties to that other thing.
Right.
And they usually are pretty well footnoted, and especially the ones on D&D Beyond are very well hyperlinked.
Yes, yeah.
But still, you need... There's a lot of... You're not going to, in real time, be able to respond to the characters and lay down narration for them in a way that makes sense contextually if you don't have a good understanding of the book. And so,
yeah,
on the one hand, it's less prep because you don't have to generate as much material, but it's, in some sense, more of a different type of prep because you personally need to consume and comprehend all of this stuff.
Yeah. One of my notes in the module cons section is you really need to read through the book a few times to make sure that you grasp the whole thing. Because, even if you've got the, D&D Beyond version where things are linked, that's great for getting there quickly, but if you don't know or have a good idea of what's there, you don't have time to read it right now. You're in the middle of DMing. So, it's helpful, but it is not, sufficient substitute for actually preparing and reading it. Yeah, absolutely. So that is one of the major cons I have in the module category. Yeah, and above that, related, I have you run the risk of messing things up if you miss something. If it's a homebrew campaign or a homebrew scenario or whatever, you've got sort of like a built-in mental map of what's going on because you're the one who generated everything.
Well, and I think a counter to that is maybe you don't have a mental map. Maybe you're kind of improvising some significant amount of the content.
Mm-hmm.
But if it's homebrew and you are improvising your responses to the players, then what you're saying is not wrong. And as long as you're consistent moving forward, that's fine. If you are running a module, but you're not really prepared for whatever place they're in right now,
mm-hmm.
or you don't remember what connections this NPC has that they're talking to or something like that, you can fuck up and begin deviating from the module, which isn't bad per se, but if your intention was to stay pretty true to it because, you like the way that it's all constructed, you basically, you have the capacity to make mistakes running a module, which is not really possible in Homebrew, if that makes sense.
Right, yeah, you can develop some, inconsistencies if you're not making, deliberate deviations from what's going on and
so either you roll with that and you just say, okay, this is kind of a change that I have now and I need to track what that affects, or you have to retcon it.
Mm-hmm. Right, yeah, okay, hey, I said that this shopkeeper, you never met him before. Actually, he looks just like this other guy, something that you have to go back and tell them, you have to reimagine part of this adventure because I, hadn't read far enough ahead or whatever.
Right.
Yeah. So, and that can kind of relate to one of the other cons that I put in, which is, a lot of times, if it's a popular module, there's a chance that, your players have some level of familiarity with it. So, for example, when you ran Curse of Strahd, for us, I had run Curse of Strahd years before. So I hadn't read it recently, but I did retain quite a bit of knowledge about it that, I wasn't trying super duper hard to, destroy the experience by metagaming, but I had like an inescapable memory of some details.
Well, and that's the kind of benign case. I think we take for granted a lot of the time that we play with a good group that doesn't cheat.
Oh, yeah, true.
But that's, absolutely something that a lot of dungeon masters have to deal with.
Right.
Especially if they play a more public game.
Mm-hmm.
Let's say you're doing something like Adventurers League, or, you run a kind of pickup game at a comic shop, or you're playing with people that you didn't necessarily choose. So I have a friend who's trying to run a game that he's introducing his teenage son and some friends of his and his girlfriend to the game, and one or several of them cheat.
Right, yeah, we're playing Curse of Strahd, I'm gonna go buy Curse of Strahd and read it.
Right, now I think it's an above average teenager that would go out and buy a module and do additional reading in order to cheat at D&D.
Sure.
It's much more common for them to cheat on dice rolls.
Right.
But this is totally something that can happen, and not necessarily not out of malice. It could just be people are curious.
Yeah.
I have, and I'm sure you have, played with people that are just a little odd and don't really don't think about it, don't see that as a faux pas.
Right.
I was playing a game once.
It's a way to engage with the adventure.
Yeah. I was running a Delta Green game once where the players, I'm trying to remember what happened. Basically, a monster, this Lovecraftian elder god was named in this ritual. And so, in character, they shouldn't know what that means. But out of character, one of these guys had read some Lovecraft before. And so, at the table, he Googles a picture of the elder god and shows everyone. He was like, "See, this is what it is. This is the monster."
Mm-hmm.
And I think at the time, I don't think he was trying to spoil the game. I think he was excited that he recognized something and saw where this was going, and it didn't mean that to be a destructive thing.
Right.
But you can imagine, similarly, a player being so interested in the scenario that they go buy and read it.
Yeah.
Or are exposed to it in some other way.
Right. Yeah. Well, and that leads into one of the other cons. A lot of times, and this is most prevalent, I think, in systems like Dungeons and Dragons. The module that you're running is based in a world that you didn't create and is public in some way, to the point where your players might be coming in with more knowledge about it than you have, or enough knowledge that it can complicate things. For example,
I remember I was just re-listening to Shackles of Blood.
Yeah.
Which is set in, I don't know, whatever. Faerun. Yeah.
The Forgotten Realms, too.
And Jack keeps asking questions about what year is it? Did the elves already invade the whatever? And I'm like, I don't know.
Right. Yeah. And another example of that, because Jack read a bunch of the Drizzt books, the R.A. Salvatore books about the Forgotten Realms. He read it when he was younger. So he has a much better knowledge about the history of, all these lands than you or I do. So another example, when we were playing Tomb of Annihilation, you said at one point, the Red Wizards. And then Jack was like, oh, the Red Wizards of Thay. It's that has some meaning to Jack that, doesn't mean anything to you or I, because we don't know what that means.
Sure, and Nerf had played some of the Baldur's Gate stuff, which I didn't know anything about. And so, yeah, both of them were bringing in knowledge about the world that I, as the DM, didn't even have.
Right.
And was likely to confuse or contradict.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, right, because, you're going to maybe have them have certain goals or objectives that don't align with what they do canonically, maybe. And then that's confusing to them, bringing in this external knowledge.
And at a tactical level, monsters pose a similar problem.
Right. Like knowing that an ogre or a giant or whatever is like, going to heal unless you hit them with fire or acid.
Yes.
I remember when I was running my homebrew thing, one of my players, one of your friends, knew that, but his character didn't. And so he's like, what do I do with that? Like, I want to prioritize fire, but my character doesn't know that. Like, what should I do?
Right.
Yeah. So that, and you can run that risk with homebrew stuff as well if you are, still using that system. So there's a degree to which, that's going to be present everywhere, but it's more likely to happen in a module than in homebrew.
But I think broadly, to tie a bow in this particular topic, if you use something that's published, your players may have already been exposed to it or may expose themselves to it.
Right, yeah. One of the good things about modules, because I think we've been hitting most of the cons, you can be pretty confident that if you are running one of these things, that it is well suited for your system. I think when you're doing homebrew content, you can sometimes make the mistake of having an idea for an adventure that is cool, but not necessarily a good fit for your system. It doesn't match its strengths, i.e., it's really investigation focused, and you're playing D&D. It's not terrible for that, but there are better systems for it. Usually, modules are made by people who are like pretty familiar and have intimate knowledge of the workings of the system and design encounters and situations with the strengths of that system in mind, and with solutions that are somewhat readily available to an average player or player character within that system. Not always true, but you can be pretty confident that that's going to generally be the case if you're running a published module. One of the other things is it's often packaged with a lot of the things that are going to make running it easier, i.e. maps. So like Curse of Strahd, for example, there's a downloadable map pack that I can't remember the name of that guy who makes those maps. They're really good.
Mike Schley.
Yeah, that's right. So, right, and the maps are awesome, and they are obviously perfectly matched to the adventure, which is super duper convenient and makes running that a lot easier. That's something that if you're coming up with the content yourself, then you may be able to find stuff that matches what you want to do, but that's obviously, someone hasn't created maps deliberately for the purpose of running that particular scenario.
Yeah, and I think the ultimate convenience is if you are trying to run this on a VTT, if you're trying to use Roll20 or something, not only do you have like a book with maps in it, but you can just download the digital maps. You could buy the pack and it's already ready to go in Roll20. All the lighting barriers are created. There are tokens. There may be like custom sound effects and
notes and all sorts of stuff.
It is as close as you can get to no prep.
Yes, right, exactly. And obviously that's not going to happen if you're, coming up with all that stuff yourself.
No, that's unless you really want to go no prep, and I'm going to talk about that in a minute.
Sure. The last thing I have on the module pros, which I think is pretty awesome, is one of the good things about modules is that you are creating something of a shared experience, or you are adding to the shared experience of the community with that particular module. So it can be really fun to find out that someone that has played the same module or ran that module at a different table, and then be able to kind of compare what happened. I think that could be really, really interesting. And, like finding out like, oh my God, when my players got to X place, they totally messed it up and they did this, this, and this. And, it provides, context for these stories that people can compare and contrast. And, I think that's really interesting. I think it's one of the best things about having done a module is being able to add to like the community experience and share those stories.
Yeah. In fact, right now at the game that I'm running with my coworkers, one of my players came in knowing that he's planning on running Tomb of Annihilation for his group pretty soon. So he's playing through it first, which is, I don't know. I thought that was funny. And so I know he's already read it. this is a case where he's just not a player who struggles with metagaming.
Right.
And I don't know if this is a measure that he has taken to make sure it doesn't impact the game, but he generally doesn't play characters that drive the decision making. Mm-hmm. They're more auxiliary or things like that, and so he's absolutely not exploiting that knowledge to advance the plot artificially.
Yeah, and that's something that I like to think that I'm okay at. One of the things that I am most glad that I've done with Delta Green in particular is I read the whole history portion at the beginning of the Handler's Guide, and I think that helps me as a player a lot to understand, based on the scenario you're giving me, what my character knows and doesn't, like what the relationship is to the Delta Green program or whatever, if indeed he's a part of anything like that. It gives me a lot of context and understanding that I can use to constrain what my character knows, because I know more, as compared to Jack, who has not read it. He does not know anything about the difference between Delta Green, Outlaws, the Cowboy era, whatever. And so that's just something that he knows less about, and I think isn't able to delineate certain things like that. Which is not, the worst thing in the world or anything. And you could, again, potentially have dangerous player knowledge of, now they know too much and they're exploiting it. So it is a fine line to tread. But I like to think that knowledge has helped me be a better player in a lot of ways. I want to kind of move on to my homebrew pros and cons, unless you had any significant deviations from what I had already put out.
Yeah, well, I think maybe I can bridge us into the homebrew pros and cons. Okay. So, I do think that I get the impression that new DMs feel like, maybe I should start with a module. Mm-hmm. Maybe a module is I don't know, it feels a little safer. It's going to have things that I didn't think to prepare, and it's sort of the shallow end. I don't really agree with that characterization. Mm-hmm. And I don't know that this is the right way to start. I mean, there's no right way to start, but there are some cons here that I want to add, which are modules. In order to work well, modules almost always need significant adjustment.
Sure.
Some of that is they should be specialized to your particular group, and that's unavoidable. But in some cases, they're just broken.
Sure.
They have timelines that don't make sense, or they have, factions that, have kind of nonsensical objectives that don't make sense, or, and this is very nerdy and over the top, but, for a while, what I was doing whenever I would run something is, as I was reading and preparing, I would make a mind map. And so this is, it's just a way of taking notes where you take a big piece of paper, or in my case, I was using software, and you write an idea down, or maybe it's a plot point, or a character, or a location, or an item, and you put a little circle around it, and then whatever it's related to, you draw lines to those things, maybe different types of lines denote different types of relationships. And what you wind up with is this sort of spider web, and it helped me to remember, okay, this character, lives in this location, and they know the following people, and and they know where this item is.
Right. It makes it easier to not miss something of oh, dang it, that character was supposed to tell them about this location or something.
Right. And it's a much better way to keep track of relationships than just taking standard bulleted notes. But what I would find is, if the whole point of the campaign, if what the characters are doing in this adventure is they're trying to find a particular item that they need to slay this monster, and you read through the module and you're building your mind map, and you realize there are only two things that connect to that item. There are only two people who know where that item is, and it would be very easy to miss one or both of them. And it's very common to find things like that, where narratively you read through the module and you're like, oh, okay, this makes sense. But then
discover that it all hinges on like one interaction.
Right, yeah. And that's just it's not clear based on just a plain reading. And so I do like doing this. It's not the way I run stuff anymore. I don't recommend it or not recommend it. But the point I'm making is I think of modules less as coherent structures that can be deployed right out of the box, and more as interesting collections of set pieces and characters and other ideas. And I don't even consider running them as they are. I significantly modify them. And part of that is just I want to make my own creative changes to things. But I don't know that I've ever run a published thing, finished, and thought, yeah, I wouldn't make any changes to this.
Right.
Some of that's personal, some of it's tailored to my group, and some of it is just I think the module is wrong or could be improved on. Of course, in general, before things like this are published, they are play tested. But I'm willing to bet that in most cases, it's like people tend to play test with like other people who know how to do this stuff well, and maybe take a lot of things for granted that your players wouldn't, or in other ways, you're just not representative of your players, and the DM's not representative of you. But what I'm getting at there is, even if you find that that's the case, even if you find that modules in general, you feel like they require a lot of work to make right, if instead of thinking of them as complete things, you think of them as interesting sort of themed packs of like cool stuff to deploy at your table, cool maps with cool NPCs and things, and you can tie them together in whatever way makes sense to you, I think that gives it a lot of its shine back.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And it helps to, the other kind of upside is it makes it a unique experience. Yes, it has some relatable moments that other people who have played that module will find recognizable, but it will help to distinguish your campaign or version of that module as something that is distinct and unique to your table, which is always, I think, something that is fun.
All right, Homebrew.
Yeah, Homebrew. So one of the things I want to start with as being a pro is something that I think is really like sort of a big deal that I don't think that we have talked about much before, which is Homebrew, or modules tend to be the DM or GM or whatever is telling the players, this is your goal. Like, I'm either putting you in this situation such that it forces you to care about X, or, I'm telling you that this is something you should care about, and you're giving them a goal, and then they have to meet it. So in Curse of Strahd, it's, you're trapped in in Barovia, this pocket dimension, and, you need to, like, defeat Strahd so you can escape, and, he's also a bad guy, so maybe you should care. Right, you're throwing them in that situation and telling them to care about it. In a homebrew campaign, it is much easier for you to... you can do that. You can just make your own version of a story that you are thrusting your characters into. But it is much easier to, in a homebrew setting, have them develop their own goals and then base sessions and, shorter narrative arcs around what the players want their characters to do. And so they're setting goals and accomplishing them, as opposed to you telling them what their goal is, and then they have to figure out how to achieve it.
Yeah, I do think you made an important distinction, which is you can absolutely tell the players what to do in a homebrew scenario as well.
Yeah. I do it every time we do one of my one-shots.
Yeah, but I think this is what people normally think of when they hear the word homebrew. Is it's basically like a module, but you wrote it yourself.
Yeah.
And I don't think that's what we mean. That is right. One way to do homebrew.
Yeah, absolutely.
But homebrew is anything that's not published. So maybe, and I've alluded to this earlier, for, 6 months, not that long ago, I ran a campaign, not here on the server, but in person, that was entirely improvised. I did no prep other than scratching out maps that I would bring on like a piece of easel paper. And some of those were done at the sessions. That is also homebrew. And I do think that modules can give people, or like the mere existence of modules can give people the false impression that complexity and depth are what make games really good and fun.
Right. Yeah.
And that you need to have all this elaborate stuff in order to execute a game of D&D that people are going to enjoy. That's not true.
Yeah.
It can be helpful. I'm not saying it's always bad, but players of all levels of experience can enjoy extremely simple scenarios, and it's got much more to do with like the mood and how much fun they have just doing stuff together than it does. Like there is no scenario that'll bring a bunch of like dickheads who don't like each other and make a good session out of it. And a bunch of people who are cool to hang out with and have pretty good chemistry will enjoy pretty much anything that is put in front of them.
Right,
not to trivialize like the hobby or the discipline of DMing, but what I found, because this was kind of an experiment of mine. Like I had new players. The stuff I had run previously, I had tended to prep a lot, but then I had done these one-shots where I had prepped less and less. Stuff that I didn't intend to not prepare for. I just, I forgot I was running something, or I didn't have time. I lost the block of time that I thought I was going to be able to use to prepare. And so I would show up and I would run something by the seat of my pants. And those like almost always turned out to be really good, fun sessions. And so that made me question my whole method.
Yeah.
And I had this issue as a younger DM where I would do a lot of prep. I really enjoyed it. I enjoyed like researching the world or coming up with a world and putting together these maps and coming up with these NPCs. And if things didn't turn out the way that I expected, if players chose not to go to specific locations or didn't interact with things the way I thought they were going to, that could frustrate me.
Yeah.
And I found that it really wasn't that hard to just lay down track right in front of the train when I had to, and that often the sessions were better that way. And so I thought, why don't I just do a whole campaign this way? Why don't I just not prep at all?
Right.
And just show up and make it up as we go, session to session. And it wasn't anything incredible. It wasn't like the world's greatest campaign, but it was pretty good.
Right.
And so that experience really trained me to, I guess, look sideways at extensive out-of-game prep.
Yeah. Yeah, it's certainly not necessary. Like, you must do that in order to run a good session. There are some times when maybe it's more or less appropriate, but yeah, it is certainly possible to have a great time without doing it.
Oh, and there's another element here that's worth mentioning, which is players can often tell or will try to tell whether or not things being put in front of them are original to you or published. And if you're running a module, they may be much more comfortable being critical of it.
Right, or making fun of it.
Or the other way around if your players are assholes.
Right.
And this has like complex consequences depending on who you and your players are and your relationship with each other. Like, one of the things we found when we were playing Tomb of Annihilation was we wound up in this mode where it was the DM and the players against the module.
Right.
And that was kind of fun and interesting. Where I would introduce this puzzle and then sort of follow it up with, I know you guys are never going to figure this out.
Right.
And laugh at you. And you guys would try to figure it out and try to come up with things that would kind of frustrate me. And it was this fun game, but the module was the punchline or the butt of the joke in some sense. And if I had written a scenario, not only would I not have made fun of it in that way probably, but if you guys thought it was bad, you probably wouldn't make fun of it either, because you would be self-conscious about it and you'd try to be polite. And so I think one of the things that makes people maybe apprehensive about doing homebrew stuff, in addition to it maybe being more work, is you have to do something creative, and it's on display, and other people may not like it, and it might not go well, and if it doesn't go well, is that your fault? Are you bad?
Right. Yeah. You don't have like the ready-made defensive, like, well, this is just a module. I didn't make it. I'm just running it. Yeah. It's like, no, this came out of my brain and my heart. So yeah, if it's going poorly, it's much more natural that you're going to feel something about that.
Right. It's like your friend saying like, hey, I painted this picture. Take a look at it. And you're like, if you look at it and it's ugly, what do you say? Mm-hmm. Except now you have to look at it for 3 hours every week.
Right.
So, yeah, I mean, there are sensitivities there that are less present or just different with modules.
Yeah, absolutely.
But I'll say, just like you're not supposed to assume a woman is pregnant, don't assume anything the DM is putting out is something they wrote or something that they borrowed from another source, because you will wind up offending someone.
Right. Yeah, even asking the question like can imply something. It's like, oh, you don't think I'm smart enough to come up with X, or something like that. All interesting. Some of my other points with this, again, kind of as a counter to what we were saying earlier for modules, if it's something that you're coming up with, the players, whether accidentally or on purpose, if they're trying to like get more information, they have no reference. They can't go buy the thing that you're running because you didn't buy it, right? You're inventing it. So unless they get access to your laptop, then it's gonna be really difficult for them to get a peek behind the curtain, or to have already played that adventure and have unavoidable knowledge coming in.
Yeah,
which can make that a little nicer, and that's also true for like I like to, when I'm running something like D&D, I like to make my own monsters that are inspired by a lot of like what's in the Matcha manual or something like that, but they're different. And so, they might have more or less vulnerabilities or different stats in some way, so that you can't always rely on knowledge that your character might not have, but you do as a player. Well, you don't have to worry about that because I'm inventing something, and so nobody has knowledge about it but me. So just another kind of facet of that.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then again, some of the other things are, again, just mirrors of what we were talking about with modules, in addition to, or sort of related to something I had said before, with something that's homebrew, yeah, you can more deliberately tailor it to your party. Right, I said before that the modules are generally going to be very well tailored to the system that you're using. Or homebrew, you can do a little more work once you figure out like, hey, who are my real world party, my players, and then who are the characters they've created. It's easier for me to adjust what's going on to make sure that it matches what they're all about. Excuse me, which kind of goes along with what I was saying earlier about making the sessions a little more player driven. That could be a little easier with something that you're inventing.
Yeah, I just lost the thread on this.
Okay,
sorry, go ahead.
No, I was going to change the subject, so if you wanted to.
No, go ahead.
Okay. One of the things I have in the cons, which is not necessarily strictly a con, but it is potentially something that can hamper you, is, again, mirroring what I said earlier about modules having a lot of content available, like maps and everything. You have to sometimes compromise based on material requirements if you're doing a homebrew. No one has made a map already specifically designed around whatever your idea for some encounter might be, or some, a castle, or whatever the case may be. So, that's either something you have to make, or you have to find something that's close and maybe compromise on. And there are ways to mitigate that I think go a long way in lessening the degree to which this is a major downside of homebrew. One of the things that I like to do is, especially when I'm doing the one shots that have a little more, it's more set pieces than kind of a free flow campaign or something like that. I'll develop ideas for what I want those set pieces to look like, and then I'll go to, I've mentioned it before, Daniel's maps on Patreon, because that's what I use for all my maps. And I'll find stuff that is close, or, I'll just browse through and be like, oh, well, I wanted this to take place in a forest, but there's this really cool, like, mountain valley map that I really like, and so I'm just going to, like, can I change this thing to fit that? Yes, I can. Okay, I'm just going to rewrite that so that it takes place in a mountain valley. And usually you'll find that you don't need to be super duper married to a lot of specifics, and that you can change what you're doing to match the materials, instead of getting dead set on, no, it must take place in the forest, and then you can't find a good forest map and you're stuck.
Yes, and I want to tie a couple of the bullets that you just spoke about together. So you said, hey, it could be riskier in a few ways, it could be more work, and you may have to make compromises, but sometimes, you can kind of leverage those and get some goodness out of it.
Mm-hmm.
It's also a case, though, like, it's very common that you will put time and energy into developing something that the players just don't wind up touching.
Right.
And whether that's drawing a map or coming up with this interesting mystery, or maybe it's like an entire location. It's like a city you developed and they just don't go there. It's a mega dungeon that you spent the weekend putting together maps and stuff for, and they just they don't find it, or you kind of serve it up and they don't want to go.
They nuked it from orbit,
Sure.
did some burn it down solution.
Yeah. And so this is, I think, potentially the most frustrating thing about Homebrew. If it's a module, okay, you just don't print that map out, or, whatever. It's not a big deal. It's not your labor. You
were never going to do everything in the book anyway, so, especially for something like Curse of Strahd as an example, like, if this location doesn't come up in the Taraka deck reading, then they're probably never going to go there. Okay, fine. Like, whatever. You didn't lose any time doing that, or you didn't start getting married to this dungeon. Like, oh, I really like this thing that I built. I can't wait for them to experience it. And then they just never do.
Yeah. So, this is another thing that pushes me towards low or no prep.
Right.
Or coming up with a system where the players do significant telegraphing to you ahead of time of what they want to do.
Right.
So it's common practice, and we've used this a lot, to, at the end of a given session, the DM asks the players, okay, so based on where we are now, what are you thinking you're going to do next session? What's your plan?
Mm-hmm.
And they may not stick to it very closely, but you have an idea, like, okay, they're planning on heading to this city. Got it. All right, I'll prep that, and I'll prep the stuff that's in between.
Right. Or, hey, yeah, we want to go shopping for items, and then we want to hit that dungeon we heard about. Like, great.
Sure.
I'll make some item tables, and then we'll hit that dungeon. Yeah.
Yeah, and another way to handle this is, a big structural change, which is I have an open table that I do with my coworkers. So I don't even have sessions unless they tell me what they want to do.
Mm-hmm.
There's a stable of people who play. Some of them play every week. Some of them play less frequently than that. And so the whole deal is, like, we only ever schedule sessions if people say, oh, me and these other 3 people, we want to take these characters and go to that specific location and do X, Y, and Z.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, cool. Then that's what I'll prepare. So there are certainly ways to deal with this, but that's all, like, those are lessons written in blood.
Yes. Yeah. No, that's a great point. I'm glad you brought it up. And so I
Me
think
too.
I think we've hit most of the major points in my pros and cons list. I put a section after that where I was just talking about some of, like, the ways I think about what are the kind of strengths and weaknesses. Oh, like, as a total concept. I know we just went over pros and cons, but, like, okay, having gone over that, where do I think it is most appropriate to do a module versus, doing something homebrew and maybe a little more freeform. So I think that modules are really good for if you've got, like, a defined period of play that you're trying to do, finding a module that matches that. So, for example, hey, this group is going to be together for, like, a year. or something like that, and say, oh, hey, that's a perfect amount of time to do this module. I've run it before. That makes sense. Or, hey, I want to get characters to level 10 in D&D, and so we're going to do Storm King's Thunder, because that's like a 1 to 10 adventure or something like that. If you're using it like for some specific kind of goals and want a framework for reaching them, modules are really good for that. And then they also, certain tables or certain parties work better when they have some constraints, like they have some guardrails on, or the bumpers up as they're bowling, and work better when you are kind of shepherding them and giving them a goal. Some parties deal better with that, and that works well for them and helps to kind of point them in a direction and have them go. And so I think modules are really good for that as well, because it kind of helps you with a pre-made framework for making all of that happen. Do you have any thoughts on that statement?
Yeah, I mean, I think I broadly agree with all of it. I would say that I want different things for campaigns than I do for shorter versions of play.
Yes.
And for campaigns, I really like the idea of doing essentially what we did with Golden River Underground, where the big picture story is Homebrew, but you can take entire modules or aspects of modules or, little published one-shots or whatever, and slot those into places. Mm-hmm. And maybe those are side quests. Maybe they're just chapters in like a longer story. But I think modules are excellent sources of inspiration. It's really, probably the most time I suspect this is true of a lot of people who run and play the game, but I have read a lot of modules that I never had any intention of running.
Yes, I've certainly done the same.
They're usually really interesting, even if it's in a system or a setting that I have no intention of doing anything with. Mm-hmm. A lot of cool ideas, a lot of cool illustrations, and I don't know. I mean, like, they're just fascinating. And so I think it's absolutely something that should be part of your diet if you're going to be a DM, mm-hmm. Because it can just give you a lot of ideas. But I don't think it's an either or thing. And you already said this. Like, I don't think you have to say, like, all right, well, I like this module. Now I have to decide if I'm going to run the whole thing as written or not use any of it at all.
Right. Yeah.
That's not the choice that you're confronted with. You can just take whatever you want, whether it's an idea that it gave you or, almost the entire thing. And you can run it on its own, or you could run it as part of a larger adventure.
Yeah.
And I think so that's for campaign length play.
Yeah.
For shorter stuff, it really depends on I think really like time constraints and player temperament more than anything else.
Yeah.
So if you are getting a group together, it's like your buddy's in town, you get to play D&D tonight for 4 hours, and that's it. Like, the scenario needs to conclude at the end of that period. Mm-hmm. Then having something that's fairly structured is probably a good idea.
Yeah. Because
if it's a total sandbox and everyone can do whatever they want, who knows where you'll be at the end of 4 hours?
Right. It's unlikely that you will have accomplished anything with a satisfying ending.
And which is not to say that you couldn't write something like that. Like, you can absolutely homebrew a very comprehensive scenario that's well contained and stuff like that. But to your earlier point, generally homebrew stuff tends to be a little more freeform. And generally modules, everything's kind of scripted or considerably more thoroughly thought out. So if you're constrained like that, that's what I recommend.
Yes, right. Yeah, and that's what I've got for my homebrew point, right? Homebrew, again, can do all of the things that we've talked about modules can do, but is often better suited to more open-ended or player-driven, play or campaigns or whatever.
And there are also very specific types of modules that I think work best for this. In fact, I was talking to Nerf about this yesterday. We really like Mothership for self-contained one-shot type stuff because it's usually like on a space station or something.
Right.
You can't go anywhere.
Yeah.
Right. You pretty much have to deal with whatever the DM puts in front of you. and they're tight, simple, self-contained. It's easy to read something like that because it's usually short. How many rooms can you possibly have to describe?
Right.
So yeah. I mean, I to your earlier point, I think these are both really valuable. They both have their place, and I use them differently depending on what my needs are. But I love modules. I have a big stack of them over on my bookshelf.
Yeah, as do I.
Great bathroom reading.
For sure. Yeah.
You can just kind of open it up to any page, and it's probably something interesting.
Yeah.
And some modules, we should point out, some things like Ghost of Saltmarsh, or I forget what some of the other ones are like, they're not big campaigns. It's a collection of shorter adventures that are meant to be woven into campaigns.
Right, yeah, they're basically long-form encounters
yes.
that you can run into, yeah. And I love that idea for, kind of what you were describing earlier is, hey, we're doing like a campaign that's very player-driven and homebrew, and then I just use, some part of a module as a quest that you do to accomplish some goal. Like, for example, your character is looking for like this specific like relic that they want in order to, craft some powerful sword or, whatever. Like that's the thing that your character really wants. Okay, well, I can just like look through my stack of books and go like, hey, are there any cool little quests that or like sections of this book that, end with getting a relic? I'm just going to steal that. I'm going to I'm going to plop that little thing down, and that's going to be the quest that they go on in order to achieve this particular objective in this grander scheme. That's great. That's like the perfect way to use these modules in a lot of ways, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah, I wanted to kind of briefly touch on some interesting ideas that I've heard for kind of alternate ways to run modules. I think GRU, Golden River Underground, is a really great example of like an interesting twist on modules, and kind of weaving those into, pre-published content, weaving that into a greater narrative, and having us play from a different perspective than what you might normally expect if you're familiar with that particular piece of work. We are playing, with the NPC side of it, and where the normal PC actions are taking place, outside of our view and being executed by other people. That's a cool twist on, some published content that, even if someone is familiar with that work, this is new. This is a new take on it, and so they're like, oh, hang on, what do I do with that? I think that's really neat. And I've read some funny stuff online of like, this is something you could do in the future, right? You get me, Jack, and Nerf together, and we redo Curse of Strahd, but instead of it just being a straight playthrough, not that what we did was exactly a straight playthrough, but like we are coming in like after someone has already defeated Strahd, or like our group has, but there's all these new problems created by the things the PCs did. Oh my God, Valaki burned down, or someone tore down the fence because, they overthrew the Baron, and, we have to go check on the crushed citizens who are now living in the vicinity of that winery or whatever, the vineyard.
Right.
And that's something that we have to contend with, not just the typical problems in Barovia, but the ones that our characters in the past have like wrought upon this world. Or you take something that they have already played or might be familiar with, and they're playing it from a different perspective, like what we did for Golden River Underground. Or you're playing as like minions of the bad guy, and you are trying to fight another group of people who are acting in the typical role of the heroes in this case. So there are interesting things you can do, even if people are familiar with, or even if you have run this module for people. You can just have it told from a different perspective and have them interact with it in a sort of, unorthodox way that can add a lot of interesting flavor and depth to, that experience where they're getting to see it from a totally different angle.
Yeah. Yeah, I think all of those are interesting. And obviously we've experimented with some of those things on the podcast.
Yeah. One of my favorite ones with that was when we were doing Curse of Strahd, and you're having us play as minions of Strahd, like in addition to as the heroes, right? That was hilarious.
Yeah, and I don't know. I mean, your first bullet in this section is every playthrough is different, even if you're trying to stick closely to the source material. Mm-hmm. I've been experimenting with this a little bit with a couple of coworkers I have playing a Delta Green game. And like a lot of Delta Green scenarios, this one that they did recently was going fine until the last 15 minutes when it went totally off the rails and they got into a lot of trouble.
Yeah.
And what we wound up doing for the next scenario was I told them, basically we'll rewind and I'll let you pick up like before you went into that building. Mm-hmm. And it's funny because they played through it again and it ended just as badly, but previously like one player had died and the other went to prison or something, and then it got swapped this time. But you can do, I think, interesting stuff like that where you don't even have to conjure up some kind of complex, I'm going to imagine that another party already played through this and now you're going to kind of pick up the pieces behind them. You can just have them redo something they tried to do previously, and it may be very interesting.
Yeah, it's funny you bring that up too, because we had talked about that during the Gru finale. But I thought it's a really neat idea if you do a campaign, like a module, let's say we're playing Curse of Strahd or something, and then you just do New Game Plus. What if you just do New Game Plus in D&D, where it's like, okay, hey, we finished the adventure. You can now start the game over with all of your knowledge and like your character levels and items. And just like, what do you do different this time?
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah, wouldn't that be really funny? And much like a lot of New Game Plus, cycles in video games, it's probably not going to take as long.
No, now back to what we've said before, though. I think to our group that would be really interesting.
Yes.
To a lot of people, that sounds incredibly boring, or frustrating.
Yeah, I guess.
So, the one of the caveats that has to go in this entire conversation is it really depends on what you and your players are into.
Sure, yeah.
But this is an asymmetric hobby in terms of investment and preparation and stuff like that. And as a DM, your choice whether to go modular homebrew and then how much time and in what way you choose to prepare before sessions, it's really going to impact your enjoyment of the game. It's really going to impact whether or not you burn out.
Yeah.
And having burned out on this hobby several times, it's not always something I see coming, and it took me a while to figure out what caused it.
Yeah.
And in my case, it wasn't even tons of prep. And it wasn't playing in tons of sessions. It was really thwarted prep, if that makes sense.
Yeah. I think it's where that asymmetry really reared its head and made itself very visible to you.
And so don't put yourself in a position where, let me phrase this differently. The more you prep as a DM, the more sensitive you are going to be to perceived carelessness or slights on the part of the players.
Yeah, or apathy. Yeah.
Right. Yeah, like if you run like a low or no prep game and somebody shows up 5 minutes late to the session, okay, whatever. Like, not a big deal. If you've spent every evening, you play on Friday evenings and you've spent Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday evenings, hours after you got home from work, getting these maps together and making sure everything's perfect, and then people don't even show up to the session on time.
It hits different.
And, be cognizant of that going in. And I have been in a position before several times where I felt like a parent scolding my children.
Yeah.
Normally before sessions start, I'm doing logistics stuff. And every once in a while, part of that is like some kind of, I don't know, uncomfortable topic like player tardiness or lack of preparation, like players not, if you put in all this prep and then your player shows up late and then says like, oh, I forgot I leveled up last session. And then he's like, I'm a wizard. What's like, how much HP do I get when I level up? And you're like, Jesus Christ.
Yeah.
What are you talking about? So I don't know. I have lost my mind a few times in situations like that.
Yeah. It can, especially again, as you say, when that asymmetry is becoming more and more obvious. Like it feels very personal, or it can, even if it's not intended as a slight at all by the other people.
Right, and we all know where this goes, right? Because then you're going to get up on your soapbox and say like, listen, you guys don't understand how much time I put into this, and like, you're going to deliver some speech like that. Everyone is going to be like cowed and like kind of ashamed. Nobody's happy. You start and you're like, all right, let's get started. So you were talking to this giant about what, like, and you just have like this weird shitty game after that. Like,
the night
nobody's
is
happy
like
with this.
just ruined. Yeah.
Right. So just don't put yourself in that position. If you prep, if you like prepping, not if you like the effect that prep produces, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Like I like going through maps and reading these modules and things like that. But as much as possible, I only really put my back into preparing for a given session if I like what I'm doing. Like, even if that session doesn't even happen, I will still have enjoyed that time.
Yeah, no, I feel the same way, and I think it's probably pretty obvious that I really do enjoy, like, writing out the one-shots that I do and, making all the Demons of Dema stuff. Like, I do enjoy that. But if I was doing a campaign, yeah, I mean, I would want to do it homebrew because that's my preference, but it would definitely be I would be trying to trend in your direction of having a lot more kind of improv stuff and just having some materials ready, or like one or two things I've thought about, but not diving headfirst into this like, deep water of preparation for things that may not ever come to light. It's just when you're doing a campaign that's gonna add up to days of wasted time. Not wasted, but suboptimal
Wasted
utilization.
Yeah. And I think that's all I got.
Yeah, I think that was pretty good. Yeah, I mean, and I think this is a really interesting point because, again, especially for new players, or new GMs in particular, to your earlier point, it might seem very obvious to them, two different things like, oh, like, modules are, like, definitely the way I should go, or it might seem very obvious that oh, like all the best DMs, they come up with their own stuff.
Running with that though, there's one final thing I want to say.
Okay.
And that's that I haven't fully thought this out, but whatever you think the minimum viable game is, like the minimum viable fun game, it's probably less than you think. Like I have had many productive sessions, fun sessions with players where they did so little.
Right. You could summarize their accomplishments in like one sentence at the end of the night.
Right. Or like some of the stuff we were doing in the early days of this totally improv game was, and like, I don't think some of the players knew that. But they were at a tavern that was on a dirt road between two small villages, and they bumped into a farmer who was complaining that his cows kept going missing. Mm-hmm. So they went and they staked out his field, and a cow went missing, and they saw a break in the fence, and it turned out that a goblin had been occasionally taking cows. And like moving through that, they spent, I don't know, an hour at the tavern because they were fascinated by the food.
Yeah.
They wanted to talk about the food and drink that was there, right? And then that arc I described, including them tracking down the goblins and trying to get the cows back, probably took 4 sessions.
Right.
You don't need to do much.
Yeah. Yeah. I've always found your like the tavern experience when you're running a game is always very funny to me. Like, because I think we probably spent a below average amount of time doing that when we were in Vallaki during Curse of Strahd. And even still, it was a major part of the experience where I'm like trying to skip through it. I'm like, yeah, I get it. Like, it's the food thing. We've done this. It's still funny. Like it still makes me laugh thinking about it. Again, session 4 of Curse of Strahd will always, live in my head as one of my favorite sessions ever.
Yes.
But yeah, that's always very amusing. And to your point, like, you don't have to create this massive dungeon to have a good time. Yeah. Okay.
All right.
I think we should call it there.
Nice.